support our families. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it back to you, Ms. Cameron. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gauto. Next slide, please. And this slide is in Spanish for those of you who need the Spanish information. Next slide. So today we follow the wellness themes here at Local District Central. Today is Mindful Monday. So tonight during this presentation, I'm going to work to be mindful of my own positionality within our communities and the role I play in building bridges. Please think about what you might be mindful of during this presentation. Next slide, please. Here at Local District Central, we also follow the 7 norms of collaboration for equitable participation of all guests and facilitators during our town halls. And during this town hall, we will be putting ideas on the table and paying attention to our guest speakers. Next slide. We also follow our Zoom norms. Take a moment to look over them. Next slide. This is our agenda for this evening. Take a moment to look over the agenda. Next slide. These will be our engaged participant outcomes for this evening. At the end of this session, I hope you will all better understand the unique importance of the Japanese community within the history of Los Angeles and how they fit into the patchwork of the other communities that constitute our city. Also, I hope you understand how unique experiences can share similar themes among other communities. And finally, we'd like you to see a path into an inclusive future that sees, honors, and better represents a rich diversity of cultures, communities, and experiences of our students and our families. Next slide, please. I would like to introduce and welcome our Superintendent of Local District Central, Francis Baez, a true champion of learning and equity for all of our students. Superintendent Baez, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cameron, and thank you to everybody for being here. Greetings to all of you. I am proud of this Asian Pacific American Heritage Month Town Hall series. In Local District Central, we are promoting awareness of the significant contributions of the APA community, and we want to deepen our understanding about their lived experiences, rich contributions, and their equity journey in the communities that we serve. This webinar is aligned to our theme of offering students identity-affirming experiences in the classrooms. This is one of the strategies that we use to develop and sustain environments that represent anti-racist and anti-hate sentiments. Join me in learning about the Japanese American community in this one of 4 sessions that promises to stimulate and inspire. Today, we will hear from 3 speakers who will take us through a historical journey of Japanese Americans in this country, along with their rich culture and deep history. Special thanks to Andre Spicer and Julie Gonzalez, administrators of instruction, and Dr. Bryon Kitayama, who is our community of school administrator, and Director Helene Cameron for organizing this series. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Patrice McKenzie, representing Board District 1, Dr. George McKenna, who supports these webinars and who allows the space for us to continue to engage and learn about the various communities that we serve. The floor is yours, Patrice.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me again, Local District Central. I'm Patrice Marshall McKenzie, Deputy Chief of Staff to School Board Member George McKenna. We are excited to support you as you continue to provide opportunities for your constituents to learn, engage, and to grow. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to learning tonight.
Thank you, and now it's my great pleasure to introduce Board Member Jackie Goldberg, representing District 5. Thank you so much for being with us today and for supporting these webinars. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I have enjoyed this enormously so far. You know, the Korean American one was quite interesting, as was the one on Chinese Americans, and I look forward to hearing much more about Japanese American culture. I am also connected in some ways because for many years, my good friend and neighbor was the parent of one of your presenters today. And I consider her one of my heroes in the Asian Pacific Island community. And that is Sue Kumitomi Embrey. Also, I would like to say that I think it's important that we understand that it was in the lifetime of myself and my mother that the folks were taken out of schools, kids were taken out of schools and sent to in camps around the country, in California and other places, simply because they were of Japanese descent. Most of them were actually American citizens. Some were immigrants, but none of them posed any threat to this community or this country. And yet they were rounded up, they lost their property, they lost their homes, they lost their businesses. And it was a terrible time. My mother was teaching in Amistoy Elementary at the time. And for her, it meant losing literally most of the students in her class. They were just one day, they were gone. So this is a period of history that is not our best moment in American history, but it is a moment we need to remember because today we still see tremendous amount of Asian Pacific Island sentiment. People are attacked, people are shot at, people are called names and spit upon simply because of their race and ethnicity. And that is something that seminars like today, webinars like today, help us understand what has happened to them, what their contributions have been to our community, which have been many. And also, because when you appreciate someone's culture and identity, it also helps you appreciate your own. And that's how this should happen. So I want to thank and congratulate Local District Central for these wonderful seminars. I intend to fully stay online to hear what the speakers have to say today. And I want to thank all of you for doing the kinds of hard work that it does to help us reach out to communities that are a big part of LA Unified and let them know that we hear them, we see them, we honor them, and we want them to know that they are loved and respected in our city, in our community, and especially in our schools. One final note, if you haven't been vaccinated, there were 10,000 cases in LA County over the weekend, 10,000. And that means that we've got a new coronavirus, and they're saying that people can get it more than once or twice. The reason to get vaccinated, because then you don't get really sick, you don't go to the hospital, and you don't pass away. So please, if you're not vaccinated, or if you haven't had your booster, please, I got my second booster, get yours. It is the way it doesn't seem to, this new version of Omicron doesn't seem to care that you've had it before or that you are vaccinated, but it means a difference between hospitalization and death. And that is what we want to prevent. So please, if you aren't vaccinated or your children aren't vaccinated, please do so and sign up for summer school. Looks good. I looked at the courses. It's going to be a lot of fun. Okay, thanks a lot. I'll stay tuned. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Board Member Goldberg, and thank you for reminding everybody about our fun summer school programs that we have in store for everybody. Actually, Local District Central will be sponsoring a program just like this. We will be offering a Chinese, Japanese, and Korean classes, and it'll be very exciting to learn during this summer. And now I will turn it back over to you, Ms. Helene Cameron, to introduce our speakers for this evening.
Thank you, Superintendent Baez, Board Member Goldberg, and Patrice McKenzie for your inspiring words. Now I would like to introduce our speakers for this evening. Next slide, please. So Kiriyama is a retired Los Angeles Unified teacher and a founder of the Japanese American Historical Society of Southern California. She was the editor of the JAH SSC journal, Nanka NICU. I know I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but I am sorry, which documented the untold stories of the Japanese American community. She was born on November 12th, 1939 in Los Angeles, California, and was incarcerated at the Manzanar concentration camp with her family when she was a child. After leaving camp, her family returned to California and established a nursery business in Torrance, California. She is the proud mother of activist and performing artists Tracy Katu Kiriyama and George Takashi Kiriyama, a managing editor of KTVU in San Francisco. Iku's late husband was an educator and LAUSD board member, George Kiriyama. Our next presenter is Bruce Embrey. Bruce is a longtime activist in the Japanese community and is the co-chair of the Manzanar Committee. As the co-chair of the Manzanar Committee, he organizes the annual Manzanar pilgrimage that regularly draws up to 2,500 people every year. Bruce is also a product of Los Angeles Unified School District and is proud that his mother, father, and brother were all teachers and union members. And finally, Glen Kitayama is a teacher at Castelar School in Chinatown and a member of the Manzanar Committee. He received his master's degree in Asian American Studies at UCLA. His MA thesis on the Japanese American Redress movement provided the foundation for the book NCRR, The Grassroots Struggle for Japanese American Redress and Reparations. I would like, and it's my honor and pleasure, to introduce Glen Kitayama. Glen, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Helene. I'm so honored to be here today to be able to speak on this webinar with Iku and Bruce. I will be covering the first part on the Japanese American community from 1882 to 1941. Iku will then cover the parts of the World War II incarceration and the resettlement era. And then Bruce and I will briefly address how the JA experience, the Japanese American experience, relates to today. Could I have the next slide? Okay, and the next slide. Okay, last week, Dr. Russell Jung of Stop AAPI Hate, he gave an excellent talk about the history of violence against the AAPI community. And I believe that he may have shown this slide also. This talked about the Chinese massacre of 1871, and that took place in LA's Chinatown. And so to me, this is just an example of the type of racial violence that the Chinese immigrant community experienced in the 1800s. Could I have the next slide? Okay, so the massacre, I did say it was just one example of the racial tension and the violence. Now, white labor unions at that point, they wanted Chinese workers out because they feared that they drove down wages. And Chinese, of course, were not allowed in the predominantly white unions. Another reason is that many people feared for the purity of the white race. Because of all of this tension, all this violence, and the agitation against Chinese immigrants, Chinese laborers were banned from entering the United States through the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act for 10 years. The act was then renewed in 1892. It was made permanent in 1982. Some of the provisions of the act, besides excluding them, was that it declared that Chinese immigrants were ineligible for US citizenship. And at that point, I believe the ratio of Chinese men to women was at 19-1, which, when you think about it, it made it extremely difficult to start families and to establish a life in the United States. So just try to imagine what life was like for a Chinese immigrant at this time. And remember, I just wrote at the bottom that interracial marriage with whites was not legal in all states until the case of Loving versus Virginia in 1967. Okay, next slide. This is an example of this type of agitation that came once the Japanese immigrants started to come in. So basically, Japanese immigrants started coming in. It was to replace the Chinese laborers. So between 1895 and 1908, there were approximately 130,000 Japanese immigrants who arrived in Hawaii and the West Coast. And they pretty much faced exactly what the Chinese immigrants before them had faced, the types of racial violence and exclusion and agitation to get them out. Next slide. So in 1907 and 1908, there was a series of negotiations between Japan and the United States. Now, on one hand, the president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, he understands that there's a significant portion, there's a very vocal portion, part of the community, whites in particular, that want Japanese out. On the other hand, Japan had just won a war against Russia in 1905, and so he's dealing with a country that was on the rise, and so he had to be very careful with how he's going to negotiate with Japan. And so one of the things that came out of it was that they pretty much did the same thing. They banned Japanese immigration. Japanese laborers were effectively cut out from the United States. But one thing that happened, though, there was a loophole that allowed the Issei men to send for picture brides. So this practice of arranged marriage allowed for the Issei community to start to establish roots in the United States. Next slide. But of course, life wasn't really pretty at that time either. So this is just an example of the type of racism that was faced by Japanese Americans. In 1913, California passed the Alien Land Law. And this was actually one of a number of laws that was passed, I believe, between 1913 and 1920. So you can have the next slide. So the provisions was if you were a Japanese immigrant, if you were an Issei, you could not own property. And think about that. I mean, I'm always astounded when I start to think about these examples of anti-Japanese hysteria, that you would prevent people from buying property. Now remember, when it says aliens ineligible to citizenship, and that's the Issei. Well, of course, this was first applied to Chinese immigrants, as I mentioned before. Now, Chinese were banned from naturalized citizenship. So when you think about this, unlike the white European immigrants who were allowed to become citizens. So if you were a person of Irish, Italian, or German descent, for example, many of the immigrants, they also faced discrimination, but the difference was that eventually they could apply for citizenship and pursue their version of the American dream. This was not the case for Chinese and for Japanese. We were set apart, and we were told that you are not allowed to become citizens. You are not allowed to own property. Now the next slide. Okay, so like before, there's a lot of agitation for exclusion. So they still see that, geez, this gentleman's agreement didn't quite work as well as we had hoped, and there seems to be, Japanese Americans, they seem to be establishing a foothold in California and other Western states. So there was a lot of agitation against letting anyone else in. Next slide. So one of the cases that came up in 1922 was Ozawa versus the United States. And what this did was basically it clarified, because legally it wasn't clear if the Japanese were just like the Chinese, so to say, when it came to citizenship. Well, it clarified that the Issei, if you were a Japanese immigrant, you were not eligible for citizenship. And so that basically paved the way for the Immigration Act of 1924. So this effectively banned immigration from Japan and the rest of Asia. It provided strict quotas on Southern Europeans, while Northern Europeans enjoyed more relaxed quotas. What this does, it seals the fate for the Issei. So imagine if you were a Japanese immigrant at this point, many are still hoping that this is their country. They chose to be here in America, but yet they're not sure what their future would be. Well, when this passed, that meant that there's no way that the Issei will ever become citizens. So all of their hopes, all of their dreams, it rested with the Nisei, the second generation, their children, who were by law, by birthright, they were American citizens. So this is just the backdrop to what happens during World War II. And so I'm going to give it over to Iku Kiriyama right now, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the Japanese American incarceration during World War II, and later also resettlement. So Iku.
You're muted, Iku.
Excuse me for that. I had turned 2 in November 1941 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. My father was renting property in Inglewood near LAX to operate a nursery. The Army came and took over the property, putting up machine gun nests and anti-aircraft artillery around the property. The soldiers cleaned out the greenhouse and bunked inside. They would put my brother Roy on the Jeep and drive around the property. They called him Boy at first, and then decided to call him Roy, since it rhymed with boy, to which he was responding. We spoke only Japanese. It was a scary time for my father, who was Issei, a first-generation immigrant. In January 1942, he asked me and Roy if we wanted to go to our grandmother's house to live. Roy wanted to, but I objected, saying it was our home and it was not right. My father decided I was right, but the decision was not out of our hands when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. Ordering all Japanese on the West Coast, both non-citizens and Americans, to be put into concentration camps, denying us due process. We moved in with my uncle, my father's younger brother, in the Sawtell area, and left by bus for Manzanar at the end of April. In camp, I remember going to kindergarten at age 3, the communal toilets without doors, the feeling of the dusty windstorms that hit my legs like sharp needles, the snow and the red jello melting on top of hot rice as I walked along the line in the mess hall. We had blackouts often, and I remember one. My mother was bathing me in a small bathtub, and a friend of my aunt came over, and I could see the flickering candle reflected in her eyeglasses. My father worked on the farm crew and later as a cook in the mess hall. My mother grew vegetables outside our barrack, and she would occasionally cook our dinner on the potbelly stove in our barrack. She was constantly ill, so we were moved from Block 12 to Block 34, where the hospital was located. She was pregnant with my sister in February 1943 and was expecting to deliver. Her mother and all her siblings were in Amachi, Colorado. A letter came from one auntie saying their mother was dying of stomach cancer and wanted to see my mother before she died. My mother couldn't go, but my father, my brother, and I went by train to Amachi and saw my grandmother before she died. My late husband, George, and his family, the Kiriyamas, were also at Manzanar, although we didn't know each other then. George turned 10 in July 1942, the youngest of the Kiriyama children. His oldest brother, 20 years older than George, was in Japan, and they had never met. He and his wife died of starvation 2 years after the war. The oldest brother here in the States, Tak, 10 years older than George, was a fire captain. Their sister Haru got married in camp, and they had a child born in August 1945, just before war's end. The Kiriyamas were at Manzanar just over a year when the adults were given a loyalty test with the notorious questions 27 and 28. It was a no-win situation because the Issei couldn't answer the questions about their loyalty to the emperor and whether they would fight for the US. They were not allowed to apply for citizenship until 1952, which made them without a country to answer yes. The Nisei were in their late teens, early 20s, and mostly had never been to Japan at all, and they were American-born citizens, stripped of their citizenship rights. This became a bone of contention, and like the American Civil War, split families with those who wanted to fight for the US to prove their loyalty and those who were angered with being stripped of citizenship rights with their families in prison and then being asked to fight. Many renounced their citizenship in anger. Haru's husband, John, was one who renounced, and those who renounced or answered no, no to the questions were to be sent to Tule Lake, a segregated camp at the California-Oregon border. The entire family went to Tule Lake, although the father had wanted to go to Japan with the renunciants and take George, but Mother Sugi said no. My mother was questioned by the FBI for answering no to one question. She later said she was afraid our family would be separated since my father was Issei. A transcript of the interview was in the files I got from the National Archives. Apparently, my parents had not discussed the questions because my father was not questioned. At war's end in 1945, George's father went back to Japan, and George brought him back to the States when he was stationed with the Air Force in Japan during the Korean War. Oldest brother Tak came back to LA, brother Yukio went to Chicago to work, and Haru and John went to Reno, Nevada. John later wanted to rescind his renunciation and was able to be reinstated with help from Wayne Collins, the ACLU attorney who fought for Nisei rights. And George, 14, and Iwal, the brother 2 years above him, and their mother came back to the Sawtell area on Christmas Eve, 1945. George remembered that Christmas as the saddest time. They stayed at a boarding house run by friends who had left camp a few months earlier. Meanwhile, my family left Manzanar around November. My father had left his GMC truck with a white couple during the war, and he left to get the truck and drive back. I remember Mr. Thornton visiting my father on the other side of the fence at camp. Our family stayed with another family in a one-bedroom apartment in the Truman Boyd Federal Housing Project in Long Beach. My father found a one-room rental house 2 or 3 months later. It had no bathroom, so we bathed in a round aluminum tub my mother filled with hot water. There was an outhouse in the field when we needed to go to the toilet. It was a shed with a plank and a hole, no flushing. The next home was a 5-acre piece in North Torrance, owned by an elderly white widow, Mrs. Wing, who was very nice to us. My father eventually bought the property where we stayed for 11 years until we were forced out by eminent domain to build the 405 freeway. In the 40s and early 50s, the land from our property to 190th Street was lima bean fields. After the harvest, we went to glean the fields and sent bags of lima beans to my father's parents and siblings in Japan, as conditions were very poor. The property is now the Crenshaw off-ramp of the 405 freeway south. Just as my parents lost everything with the forced removal to Manzanar, they were once again forced out of their property. The government valued the property at 1947 values, not 1959, and didn't take into account 11 years in business, the cost of filling 3.3 cubic acres with fill dirt, a store, and a new house. Like most minorities without political access or resources, my parents were victimized by eminent domain. And just 10 years after that, there was talk of building an extension on Artesia Boulevard in Gardena, where my parents had relocated to connect the 405 to the 110. They had received so little from the state for the previous eminent domain, they couldn't afford a house on the property and ran back and forth across Artesia Boulevard from the apartment to the nursery for 2 years until they could buy a used home. My father was so angry, and I had never heard him speak of the government's treatment until that time. He said first the government had taken his property and imprisoned him. Then they took the property in North Torrance and didn't compensate fairly. And now they were going to do it again. He was in his mid-70s, and how could he start over again? But fortunately, the state changed its mind and didn't connect the two freeways. After our release from Manzanar, my brother Roy and I attended school in Torrance. Roy was beat up every day at school until a tough Mexican-American kid put a stop to the beatings. I couldn't read English, so my first and second grade teachers kept me in every recess for 2 years to give me extra help. My sister Aiko was bullied in the 6th grade, 10 years after the war, and feelings about Japanese were still strong. There were a couple of incidents that Roy and I have never forgotten. On Pearl Harbor Day in 1950 in the 6th grade, my teacher told all the kids to talk about what the Japs had done to their families. Jap is as derogatory to us as the N-word. Another girl and I were the only Japanese Americans in the class. We were both humiliated and embarrassed, clutching our hands together, looking at each other across the room. In 1955, Roy and a girl in the high school band were good friends. He asked her to the senior prom because he wanted to go like everybody else. She accepted, but called that night to tell him her father said she couldn't go with a Jap. In the 1950s, interracial dating wasn't openly accepted. In fact, interracial marriage was outlawed in California until 1948, when it became lawful. JAs were the minority in school, and both Roy's and my best friends were white. In my junior and senior years, in my class, there were only 4 of us who were Japanese Americans, all girls. So when it came time for the junior and senior proms, we asked the boys in Gardena to take us to the prom. It wasn't anything we thought about. It was just a fact of life that we accepted as normal. And I didn't feel any prejudice in school and felt accepted. I was very active in student government and was elected cheerleader, junior class president, and student body president. For us, having been in camp was something that had happened to everyone. As teenagers, we didn't talk about it, it just was. What camp were you in was as normal as asking what high school you went to, where you were born. Camp was never talked about in class because it wasn't in the textbooks. It wasn't until the 60s, 70s, and 80s when students in the universities began pushing for classes in ethnic studies that the unconstitutionality and injustice of our being put in concentration camps were recognized. The camps had a lifelong impact. Roy told me he had anger issues for several years into adulthood. I didn't realize anger issues within myself. Thinking back, I know I found myself reacting strongly if someone affected my students' self-esteem. And one day, a third generation Sansei student came in visibly upset. She said her US history teacher told the class Japanese were cannibals, and he used a point in history when Japan was closed to the world, but trade came in through one port, Nagasaki. He said some sailors were taken and put in cages, and when they disappeared, he said the Japanese had eaten them. I went to find him during my conference period, and he told me, what was I to think if the sailors disappeared? And he said he read it in a book. So I told him to show me the book, and he said he would, but he never could produce the book. On December 7th, 1964, the student body president came on the PA and droned in a dramatic voice announcing the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. Seeing my JA students who weren't in camp or even born yet look uncomfortable, my feelings returned to the time I was in the 6th grade. I spent that period talking about the incarceration and how our whole community was imprisoned just for being Japanese. I told them how I had felt when my 6th grade teacher had students talk about their family experiences. It was the first time my non-JA students had heard of the concentration camps. And one former student, now in his 70s, told me he remembered what he'd learned from me. In the early 1980s, an incident took place in my Torrance neighborhood among about 8 Japanese American housewives. 5 of them were from Hawaii, a year or 2 younger than I. And they criticized me and told me I was negative to talk about the camps, the current Japan bashing that was going on, and the killing of Chinese American Vincent Chin in Detroit by 2 auto workers who beat him to death with a baseball bat because they had lost their jobs they blamed on Japanese competition. After pleading to manslaughter, they were fined $3,000, 3 years probation, and no jail time. But the women just said that everyone got along in Hawaii and there was no racism in Hawaii, which actually, of course, was not true. They said it was past history, so I should just get over it. It made me very angry that they were Japanese Americans, but didn't care anything about the camps. It was their heritage too. And I realized my anger came from what had happened to me as a young child. Finally, I know that well into my 40s, I was sensitive to being out on Pearl Harbor Day. I felt conspicuous on that day and would avoid public places if I could. I felt that old gray-haired white men would look at me, and because I looked like the enemy, think of me as the enemy. Many people born in camp in 1945 have no memories and often did not or do not know they were born in a camp because their parents hadn't told them. The few I know who found out in a college Asian American Studies class about the camps and discovered they were born in one became activists. And that concludes my presentation. So I'll pass on to, I guess, Bruce Embrey.
Oh,
Or
well,
no, back to Glenn, I guess.
thank you, Iko. And Iko, I appreciate you so much being here, and you've always been a mentor to me in the Japanese American community
Thank you.
for all of your work. And so I'm going to talk briefly about Japanese Americans and Black reparations. So can I have the slide brought up? Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so this is the NCRR delegation that lobbied for Japanese American redress in 1987. This was actually my introduction into the redress movement. I actually took the picture. I ran, I actually had it on a tripod. I ran over, and I'm on the far right to get into this photo. And I'm really proud that I was there to help to lobby for redress. But I also want to stress that NCRR was actually just one of many groups that were actively involved. This is really a community effort, and the community, especially and including the Manzanar Committee, like Sue Embrey was at the forefront of this, talking about redress in the 1970s. And so for those who think that redress just came really easily, that they thought it was a good idea, Reagan signed a bill, this was a good 18 years in the making. Next slide. You know, two of our great allies in the Japanese American community, rather than the African American community, were Dellums and Mervyn Dymally of the Congressional Black Caucus. You know, the Congressional Black Caucus voted to endorse, they fully supported Japanese American redress in the 1980s. And they did this even though there was an understandable pushback from their own constituents. Because you think about this, it's like, wait a minute now, what about slavery? I mean, we've gone through quite a bit of oppression too. And so, yeah, of course, there was some pushback, and they thought this was the right thing to do. And they supported, the Congressional Black Caucus fully supported the Japanese American community and the redress bill. Next slide. And the next slide after that. Okay, so right now there is a bill called HR 40, which is the bill for Black reparations. I think this was introduced in the 1980s, shortly after Japanese American redress passed by Representative John Conyers of Detroit. And he introduced it every year. And every year never really went very far. But finally, it started to gain some traction. And recently, activist Kathy Masaoka, who's testified on behalf of the Japanese American community to support HR 40. And next slide. So this is part of her testimony. HR 40 is an important first step towards reparations for the Black community. In 1981, when the idea for a commission was first proposed, many of us were against it. We were angry at the suggestion that a commission, and this is talking about the Commission for Japanese American Redress, was needed to, quote, study whether a wrong had been committed. Because, of course, to many activists, of course there was a wrong committed. But soon we realized its value and came together to mobilize our community. And I wanted to mention this because to me, one of the great things that happened out of this commission was that it got the nation talking and it got the community talking. In 1981, my parents, they thought that this was ridiculous. They thought, no, kind of like Iku was talking about, says, what are you talking about? Just, that's the past, leave it behind. We're moving on. And no one really talked about the camps. My parents never talked about the camps to me. But when I started getting involved in redress, I brought home some flyers and I was talking to my dad about it, and he's just like looking at it. He's kind of grumbling. And I remember one time he started reading it, and then I saw his face, and then he was getting angry. Then he threw it on the floor. And excuse my language, but he said, "God damn it. This really did happen." And I was floored. I thought, wow, this man never talked about this, never showed any signs of vulnerability. But at that point, you could tell how upset he was, because I think many people, my dad's age, they talk about the camp. They thought, oh yeah, it was the good times. We were kids, we were playing. And then it finally hit him. It says, man, we were put in prison. So next slide. Well, I wanted to share this from Bryon Stevenson. He's the human rights lawyer and an activist and the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. He just created this beautiful museum, or rather this museum on slavery, which is actually very sobering from what I've heard. I want to read this quote from you about slavery and about where we are in our country. Next slide. We have committed ourselves in this country to silence about our history, to ignorance about our history, to denying our history. And that's the first part of this relationship that has to be repaired. We've got to be willing to talk honestly about who we are and how we got here. And to me, this is one of the real important things about HR 40, that it starts a conversation at least, because right now, even just affirmative action, that is under attack. To talk about slavery and reparations, for many, we still have not dealt with this. And I think for many of us in the Japanese American community, we feel like the time is right now. We need to start this. It's not just for African Americans, it is for all of us. It is for how can America heal without coming to terms with our original sin? Anyway, I'm going to pass it over now to Bruce Embrey of the Manzanar Committee.
Thank you, Glenn. I think that's a really important quote from Bryon Stevenson for us to reflect on for a moment. And I think even though it's a recent initiative, his commemoration of the lynchings and impact of anti-Black racism, that is incredible work that he's done. And I think it's important for us to reflect on that quote, because I think it actually gets exactly to what many, including my mother, felt about our story and why the Manzanar Committee was founded. I'm going to talk real briefly about the committee because I think it's important to lay out our history so that you can understand why we do what we do. The committee, Manzanar Committee, was founded in 1970, and that makes us the longest or oldest Japanese American organization, community organization dedicated to and working on issues around Executive Order 9066 and CAMP. And I think as Glenn and Iku both were so clear that in laying out that our story is really not an aberration, nor is it something that is unique in American history, but is actually part and parcel of a long history of systemic racism and white supremacy in this country, going back 400 years. And I think we, my mother in particular, came into being in 1969 on the wave of the civil rights movement and on the wave of the demands for ethnic studies. And so there were a number of very important struggles going on in the 60s for those of us who are old enough to remember. And that had a direct impact on Japanese Americans as well. So the way some of the original founders of the committee framed it was that in 1969, they wanted to march somewhere. They wanted to make sure that their voices and their community was lifted up in the struggle for democracy and against racism. Obviously, the civil rights movement had accomplished many things. And in fact, many would argue, I would argue, that it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed, and it wasn't until the 60s that America began to actually practice democracy in any real sense. And it was these conditions that spurred people to go to Manzanar. So in 1969, in the 1969 pilgrimage, they went. And my mother was one of the few survivors from camp who actually attended. Most were younger student activists. And they went for specific reasons, but they had demands, but they wanted to find their roots. They wanted to seek out and discover what they were about and what their community's history was, because many people, as people have noted, did not speak about it. And because my mother and others saw their history and their story as part and parcel of American systemic racism, they created an orientation or a perspective that Manzanar wasn't just a Japanese American site, but Manzanar would actually could be known and should be known as a site of conscience, as a site of civil rights and civil liberties. One thing that they appreciated and came to incorporate into their work was that Manzanar sits on indigenous lands. In fact, all 10 War Relocation Authority concentration camps sit on indigenous lands. And so the committee, as it evolved, incorporated this perspective into its work. And my mother wrote the legislation to create the Manzanar National Historic Site. And in 1992, that legislation was passed, and it set up a congressional commission to actually guide the creation of the site. And the site today is quite well known. It's very impressive. It's a world-class museum. But I think there's two important points that I'd like to make about that site. First, my mother and the committee always believed that no one can speak for us. So the site incorporates actual testimony and the voices of those who were incarcerated, whether they were incarcerated at Manzanar or any of the other camps. The second point that guided the development of Manzanar was that it was, because it sat on indigenous land, the camp itself was only there for a number of years. As traumatic as it was for our community and my mother's family in particular, it was a site that represented forced removal of the Paiute and Shoshone people. The Tibetan Shoshone and the Paiute Shoshone people in that valley were forcibly marched over 200 miles, and many died en route. There were boarding schools, and the young children were kidnapped and taken to boarding schools. So those stories, my mother felt, had to be incorporated into Manzanar, and they are to this day. So the committee, it never saw our struggle as divorced from or in isolation from other struggles from other communities, in particular, the Black community and the indigenous communities in the United States. And I think that's important because it guided the development of our work, and it continues to guide our work to this day. Most recently, we partnered with the various tribes up in the valley to defeat a industrial Department of Water and Power site to generate solar power. And it was on unceded land and across the street, literally across the highway from Manzanar. And we formed a coalition and managed to push that off their table and defend the valley and the land there. Beyond that, we also have taken, as many in the Japanese American community have done, a very clear stance against anti-Muslim hate. And we opposed not just Trump's travel ban, but we also took up very early on, immediately following 9/11, my mother invited Muslim speakers to the pilgrimage and made it clear that we in no way saw the Muslim community as anything but a valuable asset to this country. And I think that's really important. The idea of a Muslim registry, there was a registry for Japanese and Japanese Americans in 1940. The idea of family separation at our border and the tearing of children away from their parents happened to our community. We have every basis to understand how traumatic and horrific and actually xenophobic and racist that those practices are. So Glenn talked about reparations and made a clear comparison. Manzanar wouldn't have been created without the advocacy and the allyship of Mayor Tom Bradley. My mother worked for Tom Bradley, and without his intervention politically, the Manzanar National Historic Site probably would have taken many, many more years to come to fruition. So we not only are indebted to Tom Bradley, to John Conyers, to Ron Dellums, and many in the Congressional Black Caucus, but we see our fates as intertwined and bound together. And the last point I want to make is that we're very pleased, as our sites are part of the Department of the Interior, to see the first Indigenous woman nominated and confirmed as the Secretary of the Interior. Secretary Holland is doing, from our perspective, an excellent job in erasing some of the most odious and dehumanizing names, place names in our national parks. And she's doing an excellent job, in our estimation, at guiding the Department of the Interior to a more just and a more equitable set of practices. So it's because we see our story as part and parcel of the larger American narrative. And because we have heard the same thing that Bryon Stevenson or the founders of the 1619 Project, or those fighting for reparations in Oklahoma and other places where there were massacres of the Black community, we've heard the same refrain: get over it. It happened long ago. Iku mentioned that in her talk. We don't want to get over it. We want to get over the trauma, and we want to set the record straight, but we want to make sure that America, as Americans, it's our duty to make sure that America sets the record straight and make sure that the wrongs that have been committed against the Black community, the indigenous communities, and all communities of color be rectified and addressed. And that's what guides our work. And that's why we are so pleased to be here today. Thank you very much. Glenn, did you want to take it from here?
Well, thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Iku, for helping us out here. And thank you, Helene, for inviting us to be part of this. And so, Helene, I give it back to you.
Thank you so much. I'm like floored by the amount of information I personally didn't know and want to learn more, and really about really joining together as communities to support each other. So I would really, really like to thank everyone who participated tonight, especially our guest speakers, Glen Kitayama, Bruce Embrey, and Iku Kiriyama. I would like to thank our superintendent at local district, Francis Baez, for allowing us to do this series and to support the work that we are doing in equity and making sure all of our communities are supported in local district central. I would also like to thank the local district central leadership team, and please follow us on social media. We are going to have our final town hall next week, and we will be highlighting our Filipino community. So please join us next Monday at 5 o'clock, same link, same place, and we will wrap up our series of our Asian American, Pacific American Heritage Month. Thank you all. I appreciate all your attendance. Follow us on social media and have a wonderful evening. Good night.